Hey everyone, my name is Terry Bloom and I'm with Zultys, and today I've got with us Bill Vallajos. How you doing, Bill?
I'm doing great, Terry. How are you?
Doing awesome, thank you. Everybody says I say awesome all the time. Um, Today we're going to be talking about things like redundancy, failover, disaster recovery, all those things that, I think a lot of times people don't have that conversation with people unless it's brought up. And, from our perspective, from a sales perspective, we want to bring that conversation up because we have so many awesome ways, to achieve those type of things. So, what we're talking about here is, you know, and Bill's going to help us kind of walk through all this is what if we have a hardware failure? What if we're talking about, we're dealing with hardware? So we're going to kind of address things like that. What if we're talking about, your building catches on fire and, you can't get back into your building? How are you going to keep business continuity rolling? How are people going to continue working? We might be talking about all types of disasters. It could be an earthquake. Bill actually lives out in California. Hopefully we don't have one of those today.
Hopefully not.
Yeah. But it could be any of those things. And because we're dealing with, MXs that are potentially in a data center in the cloud, we could be dealing with some type of failure in that end. So we're going to talk about and ask Bill some of the hard questions from that aspect. And then finally, we'll try to, if we haven't missed anything, talk about, what would it be like if all of a sudden we had an internet outage and we were dealing with something going wrong with the internet? So, Bill, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So let's kind of dive in. We'll talk about, I'll let you kind of take it over and let's see where we get to here.
Sure. Well, I think that phone systems, voice communication is one of the most critical elements of a communication strategy. So you want a phone system that's reliable, that sounds good, that works, and can work under a variety of circumstances. Whether we're in a pandemic and everybody's now working from home, or you have an extended power outage, or any other kind of natural disaster, you want to be able to have a system that's robust and resilient. So our system actually has that in a number of different ways, and we'll talk about those now. So right now we have multiple models of the MXs. So we actually have three model MXEs, the E and the E plus and the E plus plus. They, for this purposes, they're the same. They just differ in capacities. But for redundancy and resiliency options, they have the same features. Then we have our small enterprise system, the MXSE. We have our software our phone system as a virtualized software as a service application, MX Virtual, so it can run on VMware or Microsoft's Hyper-V. And then we also have cloud services, our Zultys cloud services. So each of these offers a lot of redundancy and resiliency options, and they're basically an inherently stable system to begin with, but you want to have additional capabilities because anything could fail. So if we look at the MXE and just looking at the hardware on an MXE is an enterprise class redundant device, a secure redundant device. The hard drives are in a RAID configuration. Has extra cooling fans, has 3 cooling fans, has multiple dual power supplies, and so it's an enterprise grade server that comes in the 3 different capacities, all the way from 300 user capacity to 2,000 user capacity. So it's an inherently redundant, stable box. And then on top of that redundancy, we can have what we call an N+1 redundancy. So that's where you have 2 identically configured MXE models. So they'd be both MXEs or both MXE pluses, etc. And then in the event of a failure, even with all of those redundancy capabilities, total failure of the one box, you can have that other spare N+1 box in the same location. It's really a standby spare. So in the event of something catastrophic happening to the hardware on the primary MXE, the secondary one just takes over its identity. Your users, other than a brief switchover, your users are not going to know if they're on the primary or the secondary. Everything will just keep working.
So Bill, in that scenario, we're basically protecting the customer from some type of hardware failure. Obviously, this is a premise this is a premise solution.
Yes.
And, many times I've heard you ask, or I've heard you make this statement of like, when I've come to you and I've said, hey, how do we protect customers from, if they're looking for failover? And your standard answer is there's so many different ways, to achieve that. It depends what they want to achieve. In this particular case, is the customer's really trying to achieve, what if I have a failover on my physical hardware?
Yes. So, and that's a great point. So really, we have a lot of different ways of protecting you against other kinds, any kinds of failures. And so part of what you want to do is want to think about, well, what failures am I going to be worried about? And so one of the failures that you might worry about is the failure of the hardware itself. So in this case, the N+1, even though the hardware in an MXE is a redundant system, dual power supplies, 3 cooling fans, the drives are in a RAID configuration. So it's an inherently redundant box. If you're worried about that box going belly up, then we have the N+1. It's a second box that is just sitting there waiting for activation in case something ever happens to the primary one. And that's important for maybe your hospital or some other critical service where if there is an unlikely failure of the hardware, you don't want to wait for a replacement or repair. You want to have another box ready to go. And really, a lot of our redundancy options are really designed around if there's some catastrophic thing that happens, what's the alternative to use? So part of what we're going to talk about today is, what are you worried about? What are the things that can go wrong? And then we have a solution for those things to address.
I think, one of the points here that I think is very significant is that a lot of times, we'll be talking to those types of customers. You mentioned it, like a hospital, and, sometimes, we get into that challenge where, it becomes a price war. And what we forget, that's kind of one of the beauties of Zultys is that, if I'm in any of these platforms, I'm getting RAID. That's typically either not available on a competitive, premise solution, or if it is, it jumps the system to such, a cost factor that it becomes not even economical. So it's almost like you want to bring these things up because we have so many advantages. And when you start getting into, we get out of premise and we get into some of the other areas, it's like we have an answer and an awesome solution in every scenario. So it's like you want to put the competitor off their game by having to address these same, type of, hurdles and things like that.
Yes, absolutely. So this is one way to guard against the failure of the primary MX. You have basically a standby spare. We also have some other redundancy options and resiliency options. And so if we can go back to the table, let's go back to the table that shows those, and we'll just kind of outline these briefly, and then we'll talk a little bit more about them. But in the table here, so we have hardware redundancy, the RAID drives, the extra fans, the dual power supplies, built-in standard on the MXE models. We have an N+1 option, basically a hot standby spare that you've got sitting next to the MXE in the same location. So if the one goes belly up, the other one can take over. We have a similar kind of functionality. It works differently, but it's a similar kind of functionality for our virtualized systems and our cloud systems. So if you're running VMware, our MX virtual application platform can run on VMware or Microsoft Hyper-V. VMware actually has a feature called high availability, and it does essentially the same thing that the N+1 does for the MXE, but it's all handled in VMware. So you would have different servers within the data center or different data centers within the company. And VMware high availability, as far as it's concerned, is dealing with one instance of the MX, but it actually handles having it on multiple servers in multiple locations, maybe multiple cities or multiple continents. And VMware does that all by itself if you have that high availability option. And then we have our Zultys cloud services. So we have multiple geographically distributed data centers, and we have that kind of capability in our data centers. So if your primary phone system is in one of our data centers and there's a catastrophic failure of that data center or that server, it'll automatically switch over to a different server or a different data center. So it kind of acts like an N+1, but in this case, it can be wherever the data center network goes and the VMware network goes. And then we have another kind, which is what we call network redundancy, the MX network redundancy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but basically that's where you have a set of networked MXs, up to 128 of them. So they're all essentially different in different locations, and you can network them together. And that networking provides redundancy in case any one of them fails. Your users and devices and phones and other things will just automatically fail over to one of the other MXs in that MX network. And then we use that same technology for the Zultys business continuity service, but now the backup system is in our cloud services, in our cloud data center. So it's the same technology that we use for MX networking, but the redundant system is now in our cloud. And again, our cloud has multiple data centers, running high availability between the multiple data centers. So these are multiple ways that we can provide different redundancy and resiliency options.
Got it. So let me kind of, let's go back to the N+1 scenario. So we're really talking about an active, and would the right term be active standby?
Yes.
Okay. So in that scenario, if I was doing, let's say, an E+ or just an E, and I wanted an active standby, very simple, just to protect myself in the event. I mean, I'm already getting RAID, dual power supplies, dual cooling fans, it's like, but again, I'm able to offer this level of protection for the customer. What is needed in terms of equipping the system from a licensing perspective?
So that's great. The redundant unit, the N+1 unit, doesn't have any licensing on it at all. All of the licensing, all of the users are on the primary MXE model, and then we have our redundancy, our N+1 redundancy license that goes on the primary MX, and then it's just they're configured together, and it's configured so that if the primary one does fail, the logic in there is that the secondary one, the +1, takes over its identity. So users don't know that they're connecting to a different box. As far as they're concerned, it's the same server.
Got it. So there will be one license, one N+1 license in the main system, but I'm not having to replicate all the licensing on that active standby box.
Correct. You don't replicate the licensing, the configuration. That's all synchronized and replicated. So there's no licenses on the N+1 box. Everything is on the primary.
Okay, so awesome. So now I've got, so that makes total sense, Bill. So if I'm in a premise scenario, I've got total comfortability, I got backup, and I guess, could you use multiple forms of backup? Like maybe I've got my hardware as a backup, but I also want to use Zultys business continuity. Can I mix different forms of backup?
Yes, you can have. They're not mutually exclusive. You can have You can have the RAID drives plus N+1 plus MX network redundancy, or Zultys business continuity service. So belt and suspenders kind of approach where you can have both if you want. Most customers don't need that level of risk avoidance, but if you are critical business like a police department or hospital or civic center, where you can't afford to be down for very long at all, if ever, then having these multiple levels of redundancy gets you back up in service to avoid a disaster, to recover from a disaster, and to have your continued operations, your business continuity service. So that's really what these are all about, is keeping you in business. And different companies, different customers are going to have different risks. So if you're really critical, your phone system is really critical, maybe you can't afford to have any sort of outage, and we've got options to address that.
Got it. And when I'm looking at this chart and I see high availability, it's kind of got it broken down into two areas. So we've got MXV and then ZCS. The distinction there would be high availability that let's say I'm using the MX virtual in the customer's data center versus I'm in the Zultys data center. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And
Okay.
and it's actually the VMware high availability is a feature of VMware itself. So it doesn't really have anything to do with the Zultys phone system. It's a feature of VMware. And if that customer is using VMware and has a high availability option, then our software, our system just takes advantage of it. There's no additional purchase that they need to make. It's just one instance that they're managing. VMware handles that high availability in case of any outages or interruptions within the VMware Service Center.
It almost seems like that's one of the strong advantages of using ZCS is that I don't have, that's part of the whole model of deployment, that I'm going to be getting high availability inside the Zultys data center. So I've got backup, that's what I'm paying for. That's part of my license. I've got that backup, that level of backup.
Yeah, and in fact, in case of the ZCS, the Zultys Cloud Services, it's data centers. So, with geographically distributed data centers, that just comes automatically with our system in our cloud services. So the MX Virtual with VMware high availability, well, that's, customers might want to run our phone system on their VMware server. If they have that as it's a perfectly great way of running the server software, our phone system. And if they have that VMware high availability option, our phone system will just simply use it and take advantage of all of the redundancy capabilities of VMware.
Got it. That's awesome. I mean, it's great to know. And just a confirmation. So if I'm virtual and I want high availability in the customer's data center, and I'm not in the Zultys data center, that's really, that's not a Zultys deal. That is a VMware deal. That's something that, the dealer would actually set up themselves with the customer, and they may or may not already be using that.
Correct. Yeah, there's no, as far as the Zultys phone system is concerned, you have one instance of the Zultys MX, and VMware handles all of that redundancy and resiliency.
Got it. Perfect. So that brings us to, unless I'm missing something, that brings us to MX networking redundancy.
Yeah, so one thing I wanted just to add on this, so with the MXE and the N+1 redundancy, you have those in the same location. So they're going to be in the same server room. So there you're not going to be protecting yourself for extended power outage, or the building burns down, or something catastrophic happens to that building. What you're protecting for is something happening to the phone system, the MX hardware itself. With high availability, then you can also get the same kind of functionality, but potentially across different geographic areas. So for example, our Zultys Cloud Services, we have multiple geographically distributed data centers in different states. So you not only get the instant failover in continuity, you actually get geographic redundancy as well.
Got it. I mean, that's, I think when you're having this conversation, I think, as a salesperson out there, like very often, I think one of the strengths to really understanding this, even at a high level, to the level we're talking about it today, is that you know enough to be able to bring up some important pieces. I don't always have a sales engineer with me to take it to the level that, that you would be able to answer questions, but I have the ability to have that conversation with a customer and talk about, is this a concern? I think a lot of the born in the cloud type competitors that are out today, their simple answer to everything is, well, just, pull out your cell phone, you'll be able to work. And, I think that is a solution, but it's not the only solution.
Which we also support. Yes.
Right. But, again, we can kind of push it to a much higher level and kind of force the issue. And again, I'm not, forced into one type of deployment versus another type of deployment, because I've got the ability to do this redundancy based on, if in that scenario, if a customer said, we don't want all our people using cell phones, we got another way we can come in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, going from, the redundancy in the same building to redundancy potentially in different, data centers, different states. Another kind of redundancy option we have is what we call MXnetwork-Redundancy. And the MXnetwork-Redundancy is available for all of our models of MXs. So MXEs, MXSEs, virtual cloud services. Basically, with MXnetwork-Redundancy, we're providing the ability to fail over in case any one of the MXs themselves fail. You'll be configured to fail over to another one. So, for example, in the upper right here, this is in New York. So in this case, geographically distributed. If say you're on the MX that's in New York, in the upper right, and that MX fails, now we're going to have the ability to fail over to one of the other MXs in the network. So could be London, it could be Sydney in this diagram, could be other cities in the US, wherever you've got the other MX networks, the other MXs that are networked together, then you have that kind of failover. So now if you have a loss of an individual MX, again, you can fail over, but now we're talking about failing over to another MX in another location. So this way, if you've got a extended power outage, or there's some sort of catastrophic thing that's happened to your building, you continue to work as long as you have other MXs in the network. Your users just automatically fail over to, and you can continue to work. And then our Zultys Business Continuity service has the same kind of, uses that same MXnetwork-Redundancy technology, but instead of typically going to another MX that your company owns that's in this network, our redundant system is going to be in our cloud services. Again, cloud services, multiple geographic data centers. And so if the on-premise system fails with the Zultys Business Continuity service, then everybody fails over to the cloud instance. And again, remember, the cloud instance is available to any internet connection. And even with that, we've got multiple geographic sites. So in case one data center goes down, everything will switch over automatically to the other. So some of the advantages of this kind of is a geographic redundancy, as well as being able to tie all of the MXs together in essentially one large phone system.
Got it. So are we really in this scenario? Are we really trying to address the fact that we may have an on-site failure, as opposed to having, let's say I've got, obviously if I'm a single site, and let's say I was, let's talk about a university. Maybe I'm a university and I've got 500 users sitting there. It's possible, instead of, just from the standpoint of, I want to back up here, and, so you've got to kind of think of it multiple ways, right? One way to do it would be to put it in the cloud and have all 500 users, off of that cloud.
Mm-hmm.
But we still have customers from time to time that they want to go premise for one reason or another. And in that case, if I put all 500 users on that single platform, aren't I better off protecting myself by going, hey, you know what? If something should happen here, I can put 250 here, 250 here. If anything happens over here, they all fell over to the other node. Is that really what we're trying to do?
Yeah, I think a way of looking at this would be the N+1 redundancy is you're trying to anticipate a failure of the Zultys hardware, Zultys phone system itself. In an MX network redundancy or Zultys Business Continuity service, you're also worrying about a failure of the Zultys MX, but you're also now taking into consideration a failure that's outside the Zultys phone system that has to do with the building or the area that they're in. The building loses power, the building loses internet. Something that's out of the responsibility of the Zultys phone system, but it's an environmental thing that's happening to that building or geographic area. And so that's why you might want to do both. You might want to have, if it's really critical, you'll have maybe an N+1 in your main data center. It may be either MXnetwork or Zultys Business Continuity in case something catastrophic happens to that building, and you can just continue to work because everything switches over to the cloud or one of the other MXs in the MX network.
Got it. And I mean, that spells it out 100%. Now, what is needed from, if I'm going to deploy something like this, let's say maybe I am a school district, I've got a high school, I got a junior high, elementary, an admin building, I'm going to distribute, all my users across 4 or 5, different, people, locations on the ISD. What do I need to add is in terms of licensing and things like that?
So the only thing you need to add is MX network redundancy licenses. So with the MX network redundancy, you add MX network redundancy licenses, and you always match the number of redundancy licenses to the number of users that are on that particular MX. So if the school district has 250 users on their at their main campus, and then maybe 65 users at each of the remote facilities, then you would just match the number of users to redundancy licenses to users, and that's all you need to do. And then you just network those together, and even though they're separate MXs, they'll behave as if they're one large phone system.
Got it. So that's so pretty simple to do. And I was looking online the other day, and I noticed we had I'm going to just pull this up real quick because I thought it was a really good document in terms of just understanding. Let me see if I can find it now. Just for understanding all the programming things that are that are needed to make that work. Let's see. I think we're over here. Let's see if this goes. Are you seeing that, Bill?
Yes.
And actually, I think I brought up the brochure on it. But tell me, is this really everything you need to know about networking and business continuity?
Well, this document is all about the MX network redundancy and the business continuity service, because the same technology is used in both. Really, the difference is you would get MX network redundancy licenses if you as a company have multiple MXs that you own, and you just want to provide redundancy between those. The Zultys Business Continuity Service it's a different way of purchasing the MX network redundancy licenses, but it also provides an instance in the cloud as the redundant server. So they both use the MX network redundancy technology of our phone system. They just deliver it in a couple of different ways.
Got it. Okay. So that's great. So where does that leave us in the scope of, talking about redundancy, failover, networking? What's left for us to know in terms of business continuity services? Sure.
So I think kind of the big picture is let's look at the things that you're going to try to anticipate. Let's look at the issues that you can anticipate happening, and then we can address the best solution to do that. So for example, as I said, the N+1 redundancy, really protects you against failures of the Zultys system, the hardware itself. But it doesn't necessarily protect you against the building losing power, the building losing internet, some other catastrophic thing happening to the building. So having something like MX networking redundancy, or if you're using VMware, the VMware high availability, now you can expand that to, if you have multiple data centers or multiple locations, you're now spreading the risk. So if one if one system, one data center, excuse me, one building goes down, everybody can fail over to the others that are in the network, and you can continue to still work, whether that's another network device, another MX network, or our Zultys business continuity service. So again, whether you're trying to anticipate a problem with the Zultys phone system hardware, as a problem that's outside generally the Zultys system hardware, like fire and extended power outage or earthquakes or some other catastrophic thing that's happening. And then the other piece that really we can take advantage of, and you mentioned it earlier, is and this is particularly true if you've got our cloud services, that if your building goes down, you lose power, you lose internet. If you have an MX that's outside of your building, like in the cloud service or an external data center, or it's networked to another facility, or you have multiple internet connections, or something like that, then you can just go home. You can go to Starbucks. You can go anywhere with your phone or your laptop or your mobile phone, and including home, and you can just continue to make and receive calls as long as you have internet connectivity.
Right.
So again, those are the different scenarios. If you have one MX in your building and that building has an extended power outage, okay, well, there's not much else you can do because everything is down. But if you have multiple locations, or VMware high availability, or cloud services, or business continuity, or MX networking, everything can switch over to that. And again, you can still go home, go to Starbucks, go any place that has an internet connection. And so you have that kind of failover as well, that again is more of something that's happened to the building. Building's lost internet connectivity. Building has lost power. Some network problem within the building. Those things are all pretty rare, but they can happen.
Yeah. So that's, a couple of things I really hope the viewers that are watching this take away from this, especially if you're on the sales side of things, is that, you want to bring up, you want to have this conversation, and, hopefully you've gotten enough now to be able to feel confident enough to start this conversation, and Bill, I'm going to ask you to say it again because I think it's so important, is phrase it for me, what's the best way to start this conversation, in terms of, not pigeonholing yourself into, one type of thing. What's the best way to kind of phrase this to somebody you're talking to?
Sure, great question. And I think the first thing you want to say is, with the Zultys phone system, you have redundancy options and resiliency options, whether it's on a premise system or in the cloud or hosted some other way. So whichever way you've got it, we still have options for you. So now let's talk about, what are you worried about? What sorts of things, what kinds of catastrophes or disasters or outages are you worried about? And then we can then see which one of our solutions can address that. Because you can do just one, or you can do multiple solutions. And so it is, unfortunately, it's a bit more of a conversation, not just doing it one way, because it really depends on what you're trying to anticipate going wrong, and then making sure that everything is in place to have you continue to work if those things happen. And unfortunately, it's more of a conversation, but it's a great conversation to have.
It is a great conversation to have, because it really, if you think about it, if the other 3 or 4 guys that I'm competing against don't have that conversation, A, they're not even bringing it up. B, it shows your expertise. You're not just delivering a phone system, a handset. And these things are important. It is an important conversation to have with a customer about what happens in the event. I'm in Texas. You're in California. We have tornadoes. We have hurricanes. All that kind of stuff. You have earthquakes. So we all have these type of disasters. And I think it's critical and important to talk about it. And like you said, not just make the assumption that, hey, it's in the cloud, everybody can pull out their cell phone, because that may not be what the customer is looking for in terms of that level of communications.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's awesome. Bill, do you have any closing comments? This has been incredibly informative.
Thanks. Just one story, actually. I teach sales training in the channel support group that I'm in. We teach our technical and sales training, and just as an example of the story. So I work out of my home. So you work out of your home. This is nothing new for us. This is the way we work. So I've been here for about 6 years. I've always worked from my home. And so the class that I teach is a 2-day class. The first day went fine. The second day, as Southern California Edison had an extended power outage. So I was dead in the water. I couldn't do anything here. So I just packed up my laptop and my headset, went over to the local community center, used their internet connection, and I did the whole second day at the community center. So that's a great example of, we can work anywhere, work everywhere. And I'm now taking advantage of the disaster in this case was my home. It wasn't something related to my home. It wasn't just me that was power outage. It was everybody that was in this area that was power outage. But I had a solution. I could just go to someplace else that had an internet connection and just continue to work.
Yeah, it's amazing. And when you're in those scenarios where you have to be up and running. I mean, I guess there are scenarios where you might not have to, but hey, look, some of the businesses out there, you mentioned it earlier, police departments, hospitals, things like that. There's no maybe we can't, we don't have to get it out. You have to get these things up and running. Let me ask you one last question, and then I'll let you go. If you're a partner out there, you don't have to figure out this stuff all on your own, right? I mean,
Correct.
So tell me what's available if I'm a partner, and I've had this really great conversation that you just talked about, but now I need to get the real guys behind the guys to help my engineering support. Tell me a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So I'm in the channel support group, and this is one of our functions. So if you have questions, again, we have a lot of options, and sometimes they're hard to remember, particularly if you're not doing them very frequently. So if you've got a prospect that's coming up and you're not sure about the different ways that we can provide redundancy and resiliency, call channel support or email channel support. We're happy to talk to you, go over the different perms and cons of why this might be a good solution or this might be a better solution. We're happy to talk to you about that.
Yeah, and in fact, I think if need be, not only do we have channel support, obviously you have your regional your regional sales managers, you've got your inside sales support. If need be, we'll do a conference call. We'll get on with your customers and talk to them, and engineer to engineer with your engineers and stuff like that. So we have so many resources to help you be successful out there.
Yes.
Yeah. Bill, thank you so much for your time, and as always, thank you for taking the mystery out of, what do we call this? Redundancy, backup, failover, disaster. We hope none of this happens.
Yeah, I hope none of it happens. But
Yeah.
you want to plan for things because stuff does happen. So we have the ability to get our customers. The general term for this is business continuity. You want to stay in business. You want to keep functioning. You want to keep being able to make and receive phone calls. And these are all tools to help you overcome things that are anticipatable.
Awesome. Bill, thanks again. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you. You too.
You bet.